Right, in this video I'm going to talk to you guys about the correlation between Chevys and Volkswagens and why I liked both of these cars. Even though the Volkswagen engineering and stuff like that is much tighter and has a lot tighter tolerances and has a completely different side to it, but the Chevys have a lot of similar things versus Dodge, Ford, some of the others. I did build a few Fords. I really like Mustangs. I did some of those, and I did very few things with Dodge. I just didn't like them much. We'll talk about that later as well. A lot of people say, hey, you're either a foreign car guy or you're an American car guy, and I did both. And the reason that I did that is there's a lot of similar things with the Chevys versus the Fords, the Dodge, and other things that, and the thing was that I liked about both cars is interchangeability, and the other thing was they were both cheap to build back in the day. Now it's a different game. With VWs and with Chevys, there was an interchangeability thing. You could take the engine out of your VW and you could put basically any other VW engine in it, and it would just bolt right in and work. In fact, the fenders, the deck lids, everything pretty much bolts from one car to another. There was so much interchangeability on these old Volkswagens that I really liked that about them. So you could go to like pick apart back in the day and you could buy a fender off of another car and it would bolt right on. The only difference was maybe where the bolt holes mounted, and you could weld those up and move them or whatever. So everything kind of interchanged. Now the same thing happens with your small block engine. The small block 265, 283, 327, 307, 305, 350, 400. That's a lot of different engines you could play with, different parts, and interchange them and make amazing power, for virtually no money. I could go to pick apart and I could buy all the stuff used off of other cars. I could go to a BPOC, take apart a Quadrajet, take all the parts off of a Quadrajet and put them on my Chevy 327, 350, whatever I was building, and I could just make it have power without really spending any money. It was a lot of fun. In the Volkswagen world, you could take apart a 40 horse, you could bore out the case for the bigger cylinders, the crankshaft journal sizes are the same. There's just so many things that interchange in Volkswagens. The difference is they're tighter tolerance, and they had a little more finickiness and stuff like that with parts. They were very specific as far as getting the tolerances correct. So that's a little bit different. But the things that were the same is that interchangeability, where you could just do all these different combinations of different things, and you could do it cheap back in the day. I could go down, take my stock crankshaft. You can still do this. Take stock camshaft down. I could turn it in as a core, and I could come back with an Engel 110. They'd regrind it. There was so many different things you could do back in the old days, and it still does. You can do that to an extent now, but the prices are obviously way more expensive. In fact, it's probably cheaper now to just build a Chevy. I just love that interchangeability of parts on the old Chevys. Same thing again with the Volkswagens. They both interchanged, and that I really enjoyed. So even the 6-cylinder Chevys, you had the 194, you had the 230, you had the 250. In my little Nova over there came with a 194. I put a 250 in there. Man, what a huge difference in horsepower. But what I did is I took the 194 head and put it on the 250 because the 250 had an open chamber. To get a little more poop out of it, it had a smaller combustion chamber in the head from the 250 than the 250 did. The 250 had a lower compression. So I wanted to bring the compression up, so I did that, and man, it just came alive. So there's just so many different combinations of things you could change around on those that you couldn't do with other brands of cars. Like the Ford, had the 170 and the 144. I don't think anything interchanged on those. The Dodge just had the Slant 6, which was a great engine, but it didn't really have many modifications you could do to make it much more powerful, as far as, back in the day when you could just go to pick apart, grab stuff off another engine and put it on there. Another thing I liked is the look of both of the cars. I always liked the look of the Volkswagen Bug, and I liked the look of an old Chevy, the 60s Chevys and some of the 50s. I had a 57, 58, 59, 50, 55 through 9 Chevy pickup. I had all of them. And I built all of those cars, and some of them I sold. Again, I did all this while I was doing Volkswagens, believe it or not. Man, there's nothing like the torque of one of those old 50s 6-cylinder motors. Those things just they would pull a house in those old Chevys. It was so much fun to drive that old truck that I had with 6-cylinder. I also had one with a 327 that I built myself. I built a 350 for another one I did by myself. And my buddy had a 283 in an El Camino that would beat 400s. And it was all done on factory parts. It was all done mostly from pick-apart, except for the cam. Remember the cam, I think he bought a reground for that, but everything else was pick-apart. We'd be down there and pick apart, taking distributors apart, pulling the springs out of them from different Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Cadillacs, BPOC, and take them back and put them in our other distributors for the Chevy to give it more or less advanced at different RPMs. It was all done backyard engineering, and it was a blast because it was so cheap. It cost you nothing to get horsepower out of a Chevy. Now, the thing is, let me talk about the Dodge or the Mopar for a second. The Mopar's big thing was their Hemi engine, and that was, everybody would jump on the Hemi bandwagon. Oh, the Hemi's really cool and all this stuff. But a lot of the parts would not interchange. So the fun and the cost always was an issue with those cars for me. You could go to pick apart all you wanted, and you might not find what you're looking for. You might go there 10 times. I remember one of my friends was running I think it was a 383 Mopar, and it was in a Super B, I think. He was dragging the car. It was more like 11-second car, and he was like, man, I think I want to change it over to stick shift, whatever. He didn't want to run the automatic for some reason. So he goes, hey, I'm going to change it over to stick shift. And I remember him pulling the tranny out and buying a stick shift tranny and going to put it in, and finding out that the crankshaft was not drilled from the factory for a pilot bearing. You had to get a stick shift. These are all things he was finding out as he's building the car. And again, the price just starts going up. Back then, you just couldn't find a stick shift motor. It was just Mopars was always a pain in the ass. Yeah, you can get horsepower out of them. You can make them really fast. You can have a lot of fun, but it was a big expense. And yeah, I like the look of the late 60s Super Bs and some of the Mopar products back then. I even liked the Dart, the look of them. The old Darts were kind of neat looking. The late model Darts, the boxy ones, I even liked those, the swingers and all that. They were really cool. But just when it came to doing any modifications, you had to go through just a ton of hoops. And to me, it was just like, I think I'd just rather build 2 Chevys. I could do it about half the time and about half the amount of money. So back in the day, the old VWs complete rebuild kit was like $300. Same thing. Super cheap to work on. Cost me nothing to do mods. I could buy a 1776 kit, put it on one, or I did some 1835s. You could, and it was just throwaway. You just put it in, build it, have a bunch of fun with it, put some dual carbs on them. Back in the day, they were cheap. Now they're not. But back in the old days, those are the things I remember that were so much fun about them, is they were cheap to buy. Like a bus like this, you buy it for, I bought one for $150 and pushed it home. You know, it was real cheap back in the day. I could buy one of these things. I mean, rag tops and oval windows were always priced a little bit higher. But if I found a 60s bug, I could find it all the time for $500 and bring it home. Even the rag tops were a few hundred more than that. And I could bring it home, fix it all up, and play with it a little while and sell it for a couple grand. And I'd make a little bit of money, and I would, have some fun doing it. The same thing with the Chevys. Whenever I found one of those, I could find like an old box Novas were literally everywhere. You could buy one of those box Novas like in the garage for nothing. In fact, I bought that in the 90s, and it was sitting next to a 55 Bel Air wagon, not a Nomad. I was sitting next to that, and I was debating whether to buy the Nomad or the Nova. I really wanted to do, or not Nomad, but it was a Bel Air wagon. So I was had the trouble deciding whether to buy the Bel Air wagon or the Nova. And my buddy talked me into the Nova because he knew I could do the metalwork and bodywork, and that was my thing, and it was really rusty. But the 55 had some patch panel needs and stuff like that. It was a complete car, and both of them were about $300. But for $300, I could drive the Nova home, so that's what I did. In the old days, I could backyard search. I'd just go through neighborhoods on my bicycles. I did this from when I was 16 on up to when I probably was 20, 22 years old. And I'd ride around on my bicycle. I'd seize a car in a backyard, and I'd go, "Hey, man, you want to sell that?" And of course, they'd go, "Yeah, well, sure, So I bought a 55 panel truck that way, and took the engine out. The engine was all rusted, and took it out and ran through it and did a backyard rebuild on it. New rings, honed it out, left the same flat top pistons in it, put a performance cam in it, of course. Always did that. Go to like one of those places like Super Shops, and they would have like the $39 Sigerson cam. Yeah, that kind of deal. I remember buying the gasket sets for the Chevys. They were $15. $15, build the whole engine. Cost you nothing. Same, because it interchanged for all those different engines. All those different small blocks, same gasket set. $15, Wayne's engine. So the Chevys and the Volkswagens were dirt cheap. I mean, I could pick up one of these here. It's deluxe, 13 window. Nobody cared about 13 windows. If it wasn't 21, 23, nobody cared. You could pick it up for nothing. A couple $100 and bring it home, work on it, play around with it. I was lost on buses, so I didn't do very many of those. Bugs I did a ton of. And a great deal of it was, again, because of the interchangeability. The engine would fit in various cars. You could put a 40 horse in a Super Beetle to get rid of it if you wanted to. But you talk about slow. I remember driving a 388 with the 40 horse in it. Man, it took forever to get up to freeway speed. Again, you guys, it was the bolt-on performance for both of those cars. You could just go to one of those cheap places like that, and you could get, stuff for a small block Chevy for nothing. I had a 400 small block that I picked up for, I think, free, and I pulled it apart, put new rings in it, and I don't remember which pistons. I think it had low compression pistons. So I took the same thing. I took 283 heads, the power pack with the single bump on them that I got again. I think I got those for free, and had my buddy run through the valves on them. And because I had two friends of mine, one of them had a valve grinding setup in his garage. He charged me $20 to do a full set of valves. So he would just take them home. I'd get them back the next day, all the valves ground. He wouldn't clean nothing, but he did all the valves. He'd be like, you clean it, give it to me. I'll give you a fresh set of valves, $20. That was good old Rodney. He passed away. God, man, I passed away 20 years ago, 25 years ago. He says, man, I'm moving out of this rat race of California. I don't know, a couple months, a couple years later, if I remember right. I can't remember if it was months or years. He was gone. But really good guy, and he was a lot of fun to hang out with. He did a lot of cool modifications to VW, or to, he always hated Volkswagens. He would go, hey, you and your VWs, I hate those. But he loved General Motors. He used to go in General Motors, and he liked Mitsubishi. I have no idea why. I don't know. No, I can't tell you that one. I hated Mitsu. I had another word for them. Mitsu shitty. It was like working on a my God MG. You'd always be looking at it, find something in a weird spot, and you'd be like, why did they put that there? And it just made absolute sense that Mitsubishi, went with Chrysler as their buddies. It just made total sense to me, because I always thought Chrysler Dodge was just weird. Everything they did was weird. The K cars, when they came out, they sucked. There was nothing great about that car at all. But I have to say the same about General Motors. When they came out with front wheel drive, that was absolutely a huge learning curve for them. They still, to me, if you're getting an American car now, they've, the Chevy Cruises and some of the newer ones, they've come out with a pretty good engineering on some of those cars. Not too bad in comparison to some of the other brands. Ford, oh God, they always miss the mark. They seem, they build so much garbage out of plastic, and it cracks 6 months later, or a year, 2 years later, and everything under the hood just starts breaking. I remember back in the when they started making better engineered for the interstate cars, the Fords used to come up with plastic valve covers, and God, every time they would crack and fall, oil leaks, just nightmares of stuff, constantly having a problem with those. General Motors stayed with, at least some metal parts in their engines, and Ford kept experimenting with plastic, and it was just a mess. The transmissions in the 80s, oh my God, it just was like completely every Ford Taurus in the world had a bad trans. But in the 60s, they still made great stuff. I mean, they had decent cars, but the interchangeability wasn't there. That wasn't there with the Dodges either. The Dodge, you had your Dodge, Chrysler, what's the other one? Mopar products that would just all look the same, but nothing. It was like you try to change something over from another car, a lot of stuff just wouldn't fit. They've just made everything engineered only for that car. And when you have all that investment in engineering, you're going to make some mistakes, and you're going to have some flaws. I mean, I remember back in the 80s, we had a 318 Dodge Aspen. My parents bought it. We looked at it for a new car. They bought it new. And with that, at 55,000 miles, the timing chain gear lost all the teeth and ended up in the oil pan. They had to replace all the bearings in the engine, and the timing chain cost them a damn fortune. General Motors didn't do that. They didn't go with the quiet camshaft. Well, they did in the BPOCs, but not in the Chevys. The Chevys always stayed good, solid cars. So some of the other brands, let's go back to Chevy again. So Chevy had the big block, and the big block was a 396, 427, 454. All the parts would interchange between those engines. So if you were building a big block, you could find pieces wherever you wanted. You could go to pick apart, find a big block, and grab the pieces off of that and make a really powerful burnout car. I had a 400 small block that it had a power glide behind it, and it would do burnouts first and second gear, just all the way. I could do them I could just stand on it and just keep doing them. The same truck had a 454, and just the burnout was a lot more impressive with that 454, man. It would just make this giant white smoke everywhere and just billowing for minutes and minutes out of the same truck. I finally took that out. It just burned up way too much fuel, and moved on to some other stuff. So even the big blocks interchange. Now you get Ford, weird. Okay, you had the 302, 289. A lot of parts interchange. Okay, so you think, oh, all right, they're really cool. And then you go to the 351 Windsor, 351 Cleveland. Why did they have two different 351s? One 351 Cleveland, one 351 Windsor, in the same Mustang. So 69 Mustang, you get a Windsor car, or you could get a Cleveland car, and you can get a Cleveland 4-barrel, which was all different. The damn Cleveland 4-barrel had the 4-finger heads. You put four, which the ports were way too big on that engine. Even for the, almost had to make them smaller to make them run right. It was just crazy stuff. Ford just did weird stuff. The same thing I found with Dodge. Other than, Dodge had their flagship, the Hemi. We've got the Hemi. And, great engine. Great engine. But they made all these other ones and nothing interchanges, like 360, 318. A lot of the stuff doesn't even interchange between the two. Same platform, right? But they just didn't engineer them, to me, the way that I could relate to engineering, which is try and make everything work on the same platform so you can interchange parts, so parts will be cheaper and easier to find. So those are the things that I didn't like about the other brands. Every time I try and do stuff to one or play with them, I would learn, get skunked. It was like everything you tried, you'd be like, oh, that doesn't work. Oh, no, that doesn't work. Nope, the push rods won't work. Oh, the valve train won't work. It's just like the frustrations. And guys would go through all the, they just persistently would want to do their Dodge because they were like, that's their brand. I was like, I just want the path of least resistance. Let's do what's fun and cheap. So that's why I stuck to doing Volkswagens and Chevys. But I also did a few Falcons back in the day. So the good old 170 and 144, I had a few of those. You could buy them cheap in somebody's yard. I remember paying less than $100 for them and selling them for $500-600, making a few dollars on them. And that was kind of fun. But, they were not a real desirable car back in that time. Nowadays, everybody, oh my God, I'd love to have a old Falcon. Today it's like, it's different. Back then it was like, Falcon, toss it. Same thing with Novas. The Novas were really everywhere, but I love the Nova a lot better because it, a lot, again, you could put the V8 in it. They had the oil pans you could find for putting the V8 in the car, very easily. The Falcons you could do the same thing. They had some cool things with Falcons. So the Ford, that body style that was in that, you had the Fairlane Falcon, and it also translated somewhat into the Mustang. And so the engine, you could put the V8s in those, but again, it was such a cheap car that, the body style people didn't really care about back in that day, until you got into the late 60s, and then those were really desirable. The Falcons with the lines going through the back, and the Falcon Rancheros of the late 60s, 67, 68, whatever. Everybody wanted those. So anyway, I built probably almost all those cars we're talking about back in the day. I don't know how I did it in that short period of time, but somehow it's foggy memories of little pieces. And even today, when I'm trying to make videos, a lot of stuff I remember, I can't remember when I'm doing these cars, and I start to work on it, the VWs, I start to work on them again, and I go, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And as I'm doing it, I'm actually relearning the stuff that I've already known. So there is some frustration in that. And the guys are like, wait, you guys you did this, and it's like, yeah, okay, yeah, I forgot about that. Just because it's been so long. So anyway, but that's the reason why I was into Chevys mostly and Volkswagens, and because they were both super cheap, and there was interchangeability, and it was fun, and literally I could take any engine and transmission on either car and change them out. You could put a power glide behind between a 400. You know, a lot of the Chrysler products you couldn't do that. You know, you could put a big block in with a power glide behind it. You know, there's just, you could go to full extreme air cooled power glide and put it behind a big block. You know, you could, it would work. It may not be the, may not last, but it would work. So there was just like, you know, there was a lot of interchangeability in both things, in VWs and in Chevys, in body parts, brakes. You know, they took the same cars from the 60s and updated the body to the X body in, you know, in the 70s, and started putting the disc brakes and everything on those. So the disc brake kits will fit on the older cars. So it's, you're using updated engineering from General Motors to update your car that you bought in the 60s. So it's perfectly safe to do upgrades, you know, like that. The same thing with the VWs. They did the same thing when they made the disc brake kits. I believe, if I don't really recall correctly, I haven't worked on enough Karmann Ghias, but I think they used the Karmann Ghia front disc brake setup to make the patterns for the bug disc brakes. So that's why they work. And basically a Karmann Ghia is on a bug chassis, kind of. It's very similar weight, you know, similar everything. So and same thing with the bus disc brakes. The bus disc brakes they made for these, they used the bay window brake system and just converted it to work on the split window. So they work. Where, you know, with the Chryslers and stuff like that, they changed so much between the 60s and the 70s that a lot of the parts, I don't know because I don't work on them, but maybe somebody else does. They will probably tell me I'm wrong. But the parts probably don't interchange between the later and earlier models. And maybe that's why Tony, UTG, Uncle Tony's Garage, says you leave a classic car stock to drive as a daily driver, which I absolutely would do updates to it. Maybe in the Chrysler world, you can't do it with factory engineering. You can with General Motors and Volkswagen, both of those cars. You can do it with factory engineering. The disc brake kit for my Nova comes right from an X-body car. And an X-body car has a similar weight, similar wheelbase, almost everything, just a little bit different. And the rear brake drums are the same. From back in the 60s, General Motors didn't change that stuff. So it was, both cars would progress using the same technology, but just keep tweaking a little bit. Keep tweaking a little bit. Same thing even to the Rabbit engines. The 2.0T derived from the old Rabbit motor. The same thing with the TDI. Derived from the Rabbit motor. The 2.0, the 1.8T, those engines were progressed from the original that they always had. Same thing General Motors did until the front wheel drive thing came out, and then it just totally screwed that whole thing up. So this TDI is progressed from the 1.5 diesel. It just progressed to this, and they've got better gas mileage, more power. They just kept taking the same idea and making it better and better and better to get the whole thing better. Same thing with the Camaros and the Chevys. Camaros and Corvettes all progressed from the old design in the 60s. They just kept progressing using the same thing over and over and over until finally they've made an excellent car. They made something amazing. Even today, the Corvettes are just amazing. The engineering, I'm not really a big fan of fiberglass or the whatever it is, the SMC stuff. I'd rather have a metal body car, but anyway, the engineering of the suspension and engine is just totally amazing. They basically took the LS engine, is basically everything you'd ever want in a small block, and they took it and made it into a LS, okay? And they've just made this amazing engine, and that's why LSs are put in sand buggies, and you know, because the whole things work so well. They just work well in everything. So You know, I like companies that stay with an idea and don't keep scrapping their other idea, trying to make a better one. Scrap it, start over, scrap it, start over. And General Motors and Volkswagen have always done that in every area of the car. So it's really, really cool. And that's something I've admired about both of those things. Even though I get fed up and tired with some of the VW engineering stuff, some of the stuff is pretty darn amazing. And same thing with the General Motors. Some of the stuff, you kind of go, man, why did they do that? But then, you know what? Then they fix it. Seems to just, you know, keep progressing and getting better and better. So I've enjoyed both the cars, and I want to see what your thoughts are. If you guys like those, or maybe if you like the other brands, you know, tell us why in the comments. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are, and I'll talk to you in the next one. Please like, share, and subscribe.